Good evening. Welcome to the Institute of Peruvian Studies. This roundtable will be held in English. And we are lucky to have here a group of friends from NGOs and institutions that are part of a collaborative project, the think tank initiative that is supported by the IDRC. And here we are representatives, people, colleagues from different countries, all part of this, from different institutions all around the world. So we are very lucky to have here some experts that we're going to take advantage of their knowledge regarding the recent Ukrainian situation. So I just want to introduce you to Nadia Dobryanska. She's an expert on public administration at the Center for Political and Legal Reforms, and Ukrainian think tank. She's done research and advice in matters of administrative services, decentralization, public administration, and local governance. And after Nadia's presentation, then you will have like 20 minutes, isn't it? Then we have comments from Goran, Buldioski, and he's the director of the Open Society Think Tank Fund. He has experience and has contributed to democratic transition of Central and Eastern Europe, and he has, well, a lot of experience regarding strategic planning and capacity building for NGOs and policy research centers. And well, after the first presentation and the comments, we'll open the table for questions, comments, and we'll have this meeting until around 7:30, 8 o'clock. I know you had a very long and busy day, so we don't want to stretch this last one too much. So, Nadia, please.
Hello everyone, my name is Nadia. I'm very happy to be here and for the opportunity to speak before you. Traveled far with my colleagues from other think tanks from Europe, and this is a great opportunity for me to share what our country has seen in the last 4 months, and to talk about this democratic revolution that we have experienced. About well, this is something very small compared to what Peru knows about the democratic and not very democratic turmoil that can occur. We in Ukraine were not very prepared to what we have faced. Well, I will tell you more about what has happened. So my aim is that I tell you what I have seen and what I have participated in as a member of the civil society in Ukraine since the end of November 2013 till end of February 2014. Now you can hear about Ukraine in terms of Russian occupation of the Crimean Peninsula, which is part of Ukraine. You can hear the international discussions about UN, NATO, EU position, and Russian position with regard to Ukraine. But I will tell you when it started and what actually was the cause for the current huge crisis which is coming, at least for Europe. So, in the last few years, Ukraine was a part of the European Union Association Eastern Partnership Program, which envisaged the liberalization of relations between Ukraine and European Union. This is also a program for the Eastern European countries like Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, which was guided by when Lithuania was the chair of the EU. And Ukrainian government for the last few years has been working on visa liberalization plans and all other requirements, strategies to sign the association agreement with the European Union. And the crisis started when on 21st of November 2013 our government all of a sudden turned 100 degrees back and said that we will not sign the EU association agreement because it somehow, for some reasons, contravenes the interests of Ukraine. The problem is that Ukraine at that moment the EU association agreement promised modernization and democratization, more transparency to Ukrainian citizens who were willing to build a real strong democracy as we wanted to. But instead our government turned to Russia and decided to go into the customs union, which can now, well, which is on a large scale is considered as the restoration of the Soviet Union, or part of the large Russian program of restoration of the Soviet Union and reconstruction of the Russian might. And Ukrainian civil society and students and the democratic people went out on demonstrations on 22nd of November after the government declared that they stopped the EU association road situation. You can see this photo, the big photograph of our European square, which is the biggest photo in behind, which was full of thousands of people who went on protests against the change of the foreign policy of our state. On the right, you can see Yulia Tymoshenko's photo. She is our former prime minister, who used to be prime minister in 2004, 2005, 2008 or 9, when she was imprisoned by our president Yanukovych, who was the leader of the, well, whose government was now stopping the EU association process. And the Prime Minister of Ukraine, who actually declared, he's on the left, who declared that we don't want to go to EU because there are gay people, and this is all, this EU choice, European choice of Ukraine is completely wrong. So for about 1 week, students and civil society organizations were protesting in the central streets of Kyiv. The protests were like gathering up to 10,000 people in the center of Kyiv, and they were gradually fading away because people realized, well, it was clear that this protest would not change the major strategy of the government, which has had different ideas, well, who clearly wanted to follow the Russia's rule and to enter the agreement with Russia on some kind of integration at any cost. So there were students who stayed in the streets. There were a few hundred, maybe, of them every day. And on the 30th of November, all of a sudden, our government decided to dispense the protest of students, which was at night on 30th of November. With great brutality, the riot police was used against them. They beat people very hard, so that they, well, to have death. And afterwards, the people who were beaten, they were taken as those who actually had beaten the riot police, and they were taken to custody, and they were about to be tried for beating the policeman, which is like what kind of a riot police are you if a student can beat a policeman? This was just ridiculous. And there was the idea of the justification for beating people was that they wanted to install an artificial fir tree for the coming New Year celebration. And we were saying this is a bloody fir tree to be installed. You can see this photograph down of this form of the fir tree. To the right, you can see our Minister of Interior, who was actually justifying the violence of the police, who never admitted that the police used excessive force against people. And to the left, you can see our president, who never raised the voice to condemn the acts of the police. So what happened next? After the night, and I realized that one of my friends had been on the student protest that night, but luckily she was not beaten just because she left that place where people were beaten for a few minutes. And this, we woke up in a new country that morning, because of course we knew that our government was corrupt. Of course we knew that they were stealing our future because of joining the customs union with Russia. But the moment when the government dispensed a peaceful protest of people who everybody knew that the protest would fade, and nothing more would happen, that moment we realized that we are growing into a dictatorship. And this is the point of no return for the democratic moods of our country. It's either we move on and do something with this government, or we end up in collapse in a few years. So people fill the streets. You can see the big photograph behind our major square full of tens of thousands of people, even hundreds, thousands of people started gathering ever since the 1st of December. That day, when thousands of people in Kiev and also afterwards in other cities of Ukraine have filled the streets, there was a provocation, well, we call it provocation, but next to the presidential administration there were skirmishes between the police and the protesters, which were also dispensed with brutal violence by the police, and many people were taken into custody for allegedly beating police. And afterwards they were put under arrest. These people were beaten very badly by the police in, well, which was clear violation of human rights, but then once again the government would never admit that this beating took place. They would say that these people had beaten themselves in the police office as well. This was all just crazy. So after that, the police started to pick up the protesters and put them in detention, beat them up. You can see the photographs to the left of those people who were beaten by the police. But overall, these protests were very peaceful, anyways, in spite of this provocation on the 1st of December. And it was the whole point that we have come to the center of the capital to say that we now want not only the association with EU, we want a democracy. We want those policemen who beat our people to be punished, to be sacked. We want the dismissal of the Minister of Internal Affairs, who has apparently commanded this to happen, because there was clearly no grounds for the students to be beaten at night. But the government did nothing. They didn't initiate any dialogue. The attempts of the president to institute dialogue were actually the president accusing people of extremism and unwillingness to collaborate with the government. But in reality, there were thousands of people in the streets, and the government did nothing about that, as if it was just fine. And you can see the three men in the center. These are the leaders of the parliamentary factions of the opposition parties, and they were in a very difficult situation because they had been willing for Ukraine to start protests, for example, a year ago. They were calling for uprising, that Ukrainians should stand up to protect their rights against corruption. But in reality, when the actual revolution started, the massive protests broke out. They didn't have an agenda to offer. They were just a bunch of populists who were out there with people demanding for some action, and everybody were mocking them. Let's put it this way. Even though all of them are potential candidates for presidency, the revolution was driven by people, not by political parties. You can see that photograph of the police, row of police and a boy playing the piano. This is one of the most popular photographs of that stage of revolution, that we were peaceful, middle-class artists, students, NGOs, people of different professions who were striving for democracy, who wanted that unfair acts of police would be prosecuted. And if the president had stopped at that point and he said that I will sack the government and the Minister of Interior and have the transparent investigation of the beatings, things would have been different. But they chose the discussion, the arguments from the point of force, that I am a president, I am the party of the president, we do not engage in negotiations with the people, because we are in the power. That were our observations. And for more than a month, these protests took place. We went for the January for the New Year and Christmas vacations, and the protest started dying out because once again it's like protests these protests were emotional. Nobody prepared for them. So there was a stage in the center. People were walking around, eating sandwiches, drinking hot teas, shouting that we want the new government. We want to dismiss the gang in the government. But this was it. We were waiting for international community to react, and the EU officials and US officials were coming back and forth to Ukraine to initiate negotiations between the government and the opposition. But ultimately, it didn't make any real effect. Of course, we cannot dismiss this effect that maybe time will show, and we will find out more. But at that time, no real dialogue was initiated with the people. The protests were dying out because there was nothing people could really do in order to change the policy, in order to have the criminals in the police and in the government punished. But then on 16th of January, all of a sudden, the government, the parliament adopts brutal laws that were prohibiting, well, that were actually start reinforcing the dictatorship in Ukraine. There was the Foreign Agents Act, which declared all NGOs that were funded by foreign donors as spies. Personally, I was at that day during voting at home, and I cried a lot because it means that everything I do for my country, for the benefit of my country, is now declared illegal. That's just, there is no future for me and for my friends, for the civil society, and for all people who would say that they are striving for a better future. There was a new crime in the criminal code for extremism, which could mean anything with such an ambiguous definition. So anybody who objects against the state policies, who says that the president is wrong, can be deemed as an extremist. Also, there were limitations on peaceful protests and grave punishments for people who participate in unsanctioned protests, which means that everybody in Maidan are criminals. In Maidan meaning in the square. Maidan is the word for meaning square in Ukrainian language. Also, it was prohibited to collect information about public officials, which was actually the only instrument for the civil society to somehow combat the arbitrariness of the government. So what people started to do on Facebook during the revolution, they started to collect information. Who are those judges who pass discriminatory decisions against the protesters? Who are those prosecutors who prosecute people? Who are those policemen? Who are those ministers? Who are those policemen who were beating people almost to death? And the government and this law of 16th of January prohibited that and imposed criminal responsibility for that. So these and all other acts that were adopted on 16th of January, they caused huge outrage among the people. That it was clear that before these were only half measures of the government to turn into dictatorship with the Russian patronage. Now it was clear that there is a clear strategy to destroy the civils, to destroy our country, and to make people be quiet against the policies that are destroying our country. So on 19th, 3 days afterwards, on Sunday, 19th of January, the violent protest started. Nobody were expecting them to start, but at one point of time when there was a gathering of people on 19th of January, once again in the square, one of the leaders of the after Maidan, the section of the car drivers as an organization of civic activists, they said that we're going to protest next to the parliament right now. And they went. But there was the row of police who were blocking people on Grushevskogo Street to go out to the parliament. And that's the point which turned into the front line of the skirmishes. So all of a sudden there appeared activists with Molotov cocktails. They started throwing them at the police. We still don't know how many of them were the provocateurs that were paid by the government to initiate the clashes. But clearly afterwards that front line was established for a month. So even those people who were initially against the violent protest, they started to come there and throw Molotov cocktails and stones at the police, because it was also like an emotional outburst, like without any dialogue from the government. Many people decided that it's about time to start fighting against the government in the way they need. But the thing is that after that time, the Russian media and Ukrainian state-controlled media, they tried to turn, to show as if we were extremists, terrorists who wanted to take over, nationalists, fascists who wanted to take over the government, install the dictatorship, and the government was doing the right thing in order to protect the people of Ukraine against the fascists. And in reality, these were the people of different professions who would come to Kyiv and participate in this. You would hear the telephone conversations that, oh, please postpone my meeting with the business partners tomorrow because I'm in Maidan and I'm busy throwing a Molotov cocktail. My office is next to this place where this front line was, and I could hear these events taking place. The police throwing the light grenades into people, and people throwing the fireworks at the police. So it was a very exciting place to be. Ukrainians, we started using the tires in order to burning tires on the front line so that the police cannot see the protesters clearly. And this, I can see here, okay, but the tires have been also the symbol of the Euromaidan revolution. But then the police started to use more force, so they couldn't pass this fire line with the tires, and they started shooting at people. They would say that the shootings were not with the guns, but on 22nd of January, there were first victims of the shootings by the police over this place. You can see them. These three men were. Two of them were shot, and one of them was taken and tortured to death by we think that it was police. The man down, you can see the naked one was kidnapped by the police, and in front of the whole city he was undressed and tortured, and it was like minus 20 degrees of frost. We constructed barricades in the center of Kyiv to protect from the police. All operations on Maidan were crowdsourced and crowdfunded through the internet, Twitter, and other means of internet communication. People started raising money in order to buy food for the protesters, to buy warm clothes. We brought money for the medication for the victims who were beaten up by the police. After the first killing started, the doctors started opening the medical field surgeries to treat people, and these doctors were working just because they wanted to. This was the moment when actually we as Ukrainians realized that we care about each other, and when there is someone who we can trust and who says that people are being killed, we need medication to treat them, because the state hospitals, they take these patients and give them into police, who then beats them to half death and then puts them in jail. The people have started to self-organize. We opened a few hospitals where the people were treated by the doctors for free. We still have, it's 2 months now from the start of the clashes, and we still have loads of medication that has to be somehow, it was automated, and we now don't know what to do with it, because there is too much and it was not used. So it was all this moment of social capital that was created at that time. We're still amazed. But the number of victims has grown, and the government eventually developed an anti-terrorist operation against protesters, which was deployed after 18th of February without any legal grounds for that, of course. And what happened is that on 18th century of February there was a large demonstration to the cabinet of ministers, and afterwards the police started shooting guns against the people, throwing bombs. They were using the drone transporters, the armored machines against people, and they burned the labor office, the labor union's building. You can see it behind where the protesters and the hospital was in. So many people died, and for now we have around 120 people who died in the clashes with the police, and daily some people are dying of the wounds. We have 150 people missing, and we don't know where they are. So, but as a result of all these events, our president fled on 22nd of February. We still don't know what was the real reason for him fleeing. Was it that he was afraid of the protesters? Was it as a result of negotiations of the European Union states and him? Was it because the president of Russia did they had an agreement with the president of Russia? But for now we are free of him. We have a new government. We have a temporary president, the head of the parliament now. We returned to our constitution, which limits the powers of the president. We're in big trouble now because of the Russian occupation that has started just the very moment the president started shortly after the president fled. Because the state is weak, the police is demoralized after it was killing people. So this is a very hard time for Ukraine. But we are very self-organized now, and we're hoping for the best. Let's put it this way. There's a lot to say. If afterwards, when you have questions, I'll be happy to respond to them. Now I'll give the floor to Goran to continue.
First of all, a couple of words about my links with Ukraine. I live and work out of Budapest, but I lead a program that has been working in Ukraine for the past 10 years, and actually a lot of people, not only like Nadia, but a lot of organizations we've worked with, and I have extensively traveled in Ukraine, in particular in the eastern parts of Ukraine, which are at the moment probably the most interesting for the world. I tried, knowing that Nadia will cover more about what happened, I tried to look at the various implications and in a way how it changed the European reality and how I believe that slowly and gradually some of the world realities will be affected by this event. And apologies, I won't be able to cover all the various implications, I will focus on some. If Nadia was about photos, I will start with some numbers. I think it's important to reflect those, and the first number you see in the left corner is actually the percent of population of Crimea that wanted to join Russia on May 2013. And this is a credible poll by Gallup Institute, so it's acknowledged by all parties involved. And as you can see, and probably compared to the 95% of people who voted with the gun barrel next to their head, very dramatically different numbers, even numbers in decline. As you can notice, from October 2011, the number of Crimean citizens that were in favor of joining Russia declined from 33 to 23%. This number talks a lot about democracy and where we are at this point in time. I'll come back to this. The second number in the top right corner is a lot about mercantilism or trade. I think it's important because a lot of the policies that we see now and a lot of the responses take care more about the money and take care more about what's at stake and what's to be lost. And I think it's very important to be aware of what this conflict very often is associated with. And that's association about actually European Union and Russia. As you can see, there is a dramatic difference in trade between US and Russia. Almost US trade with Russia is insignificant. They can afford a lot of things on the economic front, unlike Europe. And interestingly enough, Europe is by far the biggest trade partner of Russia. We're talking about magnitude of 7 with the next trade partner, which is China. So I think it's also important. And then, most importantly, that 76.3% of all the export that Russia does are in oil and gas. So that means Europe is the biggest consumer of Russia's gas and oil, and often most of the analysis will revolve around the energy policy. The third number in the bottom corner, that was about the economy. The third number is the number of Russian troops as of this morning on the Ukrainian border. And this is directly from Reuters, of estimates from the American intelligence services, and the approximate number is around 30,000. It's not clear whether but one thing is clear, that there is a pile-up of military force there, and most of it is actually a military force that could be used for an intervention in eastern Ukraine. And that talks about another dimension of this crisis, which is the crisis in security domain, and actually potentially could involve NATO, could be reminiscent of the Cold War. I will talk a bit more later how it's not, but for a lot of analysts it could be reminiscent of the Cold War, and it could basically threaten much more than just Ukraine. The last part in the bottom left corner is basically a lot about ideologies. And ideologies, basically the Euro-Asian ideology, which has been not only voiced and verbalized, which has been also well documented by now in Kremlin and in Moscow, with number of people spearheading it, both in the academia and in the administration, versus European integration. And I put on purpose the inverted commas because, interestingly speaking, both offers that Ukraine received were not for a full-fledged integration into Europe and European market. And the Euro-Asia market is not about actually recreating the Soviet Union. It's actually something in between. So it's interesting, and I prefer to look at them as ideologies. So these are sort of numbers that I want to throw at you, and I will focus on three implications which I think are very important. One, and often, and if you follow the world news, often forgotten, is actually Ukraine, the very country in question. Everybody analyzes how much this impacts Europe, how much it impacts US, how it changes the forces in the UN, what does it mean for Russia, and so on. And a country of 40 million people is simply eliminated from the debate. And I say this because actually this is not Crimea Peninsula, which is only 2 million people. We're talking about a mid-sized country in this respect, which actually a lot of countries in the world could take a note and, frankly speaking, will be concerned if suddenly they're not part of the discourse. And I think it's important to mention this because at the moment, with all the talk about Russia and Europe and US, it's for them it's a cabinet talk. Nobody has suffered yet any real damage from all these things. The only one who has suffered real damage is Ukraine and the people in Ukraine. And Nadia talked a lot about the dignity. Actually, they were part of a corrupt system for long, but eventually it was the dignity of the Ukrainian people that brought this into the fore because they felt, okay, there is a line to which you cannot cross, and obviously the president crossed it, and that's why they were also ready to lose their lives. But now there are many more other processes happening. One thing which is important is that this one, having a common enemy, usually unites the forces. It's an unprecedented union of Ukraine. And a lot of analysis in Western press you will see about the division of Russian-speaking Ukraine and Ukrainian-speaking Ukraine and so on. If you go down in the terrain, this is nice on a map, but it doesn't reflect among the people. Actually, a lot of things that reflect there are defense against Russia, and the forces are united. When I say forces are united, let's not forget that we're talking both about people, but we're also talking about the oligarchs, so the money as well. It's important to mention that the richest Ukrainian oligarch, Rinat Akhmetov, whose wealth is well above $20 billion US, lost $500 million in the period between mid-February, end of February and mid-March. You didn't know that. Okay, we'll come with the Russian oligarchs. So he lost, and he resides in Donetsk, which allegedly is supposed to be part of Russia. And these oligarchs are very much concerned that if they're dictated by Kremlin, they will not be able to freely enjoy their wealth, which has been acquired, as we know, in very dodgy circumstances. But this is important because we're talking about people, we're talking about oligarchs as well, and the money, which are becoming and are actually resentful. Nadia was present there in person. I follow some of the debates also behind behind the curtains. Interestingly enough, some of the money paid were by citizens' donations, but there are clear allegations that some of the oligarchs gladly gave money to be converted into, basically to buy food and bring to these people at Maidan. Nevertheless, luckily it's spring and summer approaching in Ukraine. That's very important. They sustain big temperatures. Why? Because their gas bills will soon increase by minimum 50%. Then they will sign an IMF standby arrangement of $18 to $19 billion. This is also unprecedented in Ukrainian history and unprecedented for any country in their situation. They will have to do, in return, they have to do deep reforms, also unprecedented for the country in the last 20 years. And on top of that, they have to organize presidential and parliamentary elections in a democratic environment. All this with the threat of war, of potential war or conflict in the eastern part of Ukraine, which is not written off. Now, that's about Ukraine. What are the economic ramifications? Let's start from the Russians, because I think we've all talked about Europeans a lot. You probably heard in the Western press about the Americans. Let's start with how much Russians lost so far. 18.3 billion. The top 19, the top richest Russian oligarchs lost $18.3 billion in the period from February 28 until March 14, which is roughly 8% of their total wealth. So it's important that actually some people start hurting. They recuperated some of this money because that was on the Russian stock exchange, but that will not change dramatically. There will be some losses. Then, what's important to know now on the other part, on the Western Europe, and when you see their meek response, a lot of people will think about European doves as opposed as Russian eagles. But the doves actually have a lot of money to be concerned with. First is about exposure of European banks. They have around 156 billion US dollars. Sorry, everything is billion in this story, so maybe it will get blurred, but it's a lot of money involved. So they have 156 billions, mainly French money, 51, Italian 28.6, and German 23.7 billion, which are invested in Russian banks alone. So basically, if you say asset freeze on the West, the open question will be what will happen with this money in the East? Then the key question here, or at least most talked about, is the gas. It's important to know that the amount of money that we're talking here is $70 billion, or 3% of the Russian GDP. So obviously a significant percentage of Russian income. And obviously it's a leverage for Russia to say we're not going to send you gas and you will freeze or you won't be able to run your plants. But as well, if Europe decides we don't want your gas any longer, that might be even a bigger hurt for Russia, 3% of the GDP, because that's something else that I will come back to that. Then the last thing is that most of Europeans talk about Ukraine and the neighborhood and about the economic ramifications there, but Russians have penetrated a lot into the mainstream of Europe. Not only that they're buying houses in London and investing in London and so on, they actually have already been bribing or buying legitimately influence in a lot of European countries. The most obvious and visible example is Cyprus. And let's not forget that Cyprus was bailed out recently, and Russians hold a partial key of that bailout because most of the money that were lost were Russian money there. Let's not forget some of the traditional allies, like Greece, They're also among, like Hungary, where I live, that recently signed a $10 billion agreement for Russia to build a new nuclear plant, and a lot of deals on the side. Let's not forget that Europe is suffering from an upsurge of extreme right parties, and interestingly enough, out of the 18 extreme right parties, 14 are pro-Russian. And links about them being funded by Russia are exposed day by day. And interestingly enough, they will have unprecedented leverage and influence in the European Parliament after the May election. So the game of economic front and economic ramifications is a complex one. If Cold War was a chessboard, this is a game of a monopoly, because and a monopoly in which some of the assets are joint ventures. So we should not forget that there is no clear divide as it were in the past. So the question that I put here, it's not so much the Hamlet to sanction or not to sanction, but what a sanction would really mean to these people. If the initial sanctions by Europeans are any indication, that means nothing. They cause laughter. The American sanctions at least enlisted top aides of Putin. The running joke in Kremlin, and not only in Kremlin, in some European capitals that know how Moscow works, was that actually Putin even didn't know the 21 names that were listed on the European sanction list. That they were so down the food chain of that hierarchy that actually some of those were even unknown to Putin himself. So obviously it didn't hurt. But the key question is the following. The key question is in the gas. If you look at some of the analysis, Bruegel, influential think tank in Brussels, already started counting how much it will cost if Europe completely blocks or stops using Russian gas. Their optimistic projection is 400 million. If you think that 400 million is a lot compared to 70 billion loss of Russia, that might be a game changer. But there are not many brave hearts in Europe. It's very important to know about the economic sanctions. It's the basic principle about sanctioning, and that is not how much damage you can inflict on the other side. In this case, how much damage European Union can inflict on Russia, but actually how much damage EU can demonstrate to tolerate in its own ranks, meaning how much money in the short term they will be able to lose. And also, I'm not an energy specialist, but all the analysis says that Russians cannot suddenly start selling their gas to China and other customers. And that's also important to understand, especially not in a short run. So Europe is left with a number of questions there. Now let me go with the European world order. I think it's important to understand the European psyche, in which the post-world, Second World War, it was a peaceful region. Interestingly enough, there was a civil war in Yugoslavia, there were a lot of secessions and so on, but Europe maintained this, that we were a peaceful region and this is what we should maintain. And there were no border change. Technically this is incorrect. Kosovo is de facto, and in some cases de jure, a border change. Cyprus and the Cyprus problem and the accepting it in European Union is an issue with the border change. A number of other things. But in the minds of Europeans, it was all about being a peaceful post-Second World War region in which they had a control. Crimea is a clear game changer where Russia sends a signal, says we can also change borders and you cannot do anything about that. And I think it's important. Now this is more about the geopolitical side. And you remember I put this Euro-Asian versus European integration paradigm. I was in Brussels 2 weeks ago, and it's interesting that when you talk to the Europeans, they were not aware that when they conditioned Ukraine to accept either the customs union or the agreement with the European Union, meaning at that time called the European Agreement, now it's called European Pact, interesting change in language, they were not aware that Ukraine will have to really turn back on Russia. So basically they conditioned them inadvertently or purposely. But it's important to understand this, that Ukraine had this moment in November when they had to choose, do I go left or right? Well, they're in the middle, and they will be stuck in that middle for a long time. Then the second thing, what's important is now looking from the Russia perspective. With this, they install a policy or a doctrine of direct interference. And they're using an excuse of protecting Russian-speaking population, which is a very lame excuse for anybody who knows things how they operate in Ukraine, which will be even a lamer excuse in most of other European countries, but it works, it captures the public opinion in Russia, and it's supported by an amazing propaganda machine. And that should not be underestimated, and that should not be underestimated that this is done in a very professional manner, including even, Western specialists and so on. And as well, it's done also by targeting Westerners who are subject to that propaganda. And actually, there is a lot of people in Western Europe that will today say, no, don't touch it. Even if you look, a lot of analysts says, no, this is like in a bar, the girlfriend is going there, and then some other boy looks at the girl, and then her boyfriend wants to fight, and says, no, leave it, it's not important, there is another bar we'll look at there. It's very interesting sort of post-rationalization of what has happened. So, why this is important, and as I put it, and I will close with this about the world order, and I hope there will be more questions that we can discuss. It seems that Europe is taking a strategy of saying, this is happening in our backyard, and as long as it doesn't, if there is a fire, too bad, but as long as our house doesn't catch up, we're still okay. Because at the moment we don't have the energy to fight. Frankly speaking, they're right. After the European crisis and financial crisis, Europe is not the continent it used to be. But also it means leaving the Euro-Asian project really open. And that really sets peril in a lot of places, not only Ukraine. Let's not forget that this is not an isolated case. This is a very consistent strategy. Our colleague here, Irina, could speak about Georgia. In 2008, Russia was much more careful and actually retrieved back from Georgia proper, except Ossetia, Abkhazia. But nevertheless, this is a policy in which the boldness and the grab, the land grab, just increases by the day. And the question is how much this will be, Europe will be able to contain. As you notice, I didn't mention Europe so many times because I forgot purposely, or because I come from Europe, or I forgot on purpose the US. I mention it because essentially this is European neighborhood. And even if US does many more bold things, they will not suffer as many things. US will be called upon only if NATO and the security forces are supposed to intervene. But if it comes down only to economy, and if it comes down only to looking into eyes between the West and the Eastern Europe, US will be an important negotiator. Maybe US will look to be at the forefront, but eventually the states will be biggest for EU and the EU project altogether as such, not only its own periphery. So let me close by saying it's a complex issue. We should not forget Ukraine first, because these people have a direct suffering. We should not forget that there is a number of lenses to look at this problem. I didn't even mention the whole democracy issue, which will be at stake for the purpose of shortness of time. But it's important that we look at the money, that we look at the geostrategic, the military consequences, and eventually the consequences of what kind of societies will operate in Europe in the near future.
I would like to listen more, to hear more about President Yanukovych's rationality. I mean, he won the elections based on a platform that stressed a preferred association with Russia against the European Union, and well, this suggests that the Ukrainians that was a contested issue. I mean, and it seems from outside that the protests were localized from Kiev, and as you mentioned, came from students and middle sectors. I would like to know what about the rest of the country, what about other sectors from the population? is that the biggest, I don't know, the biggest political issue in Ukraine? What development strategy you should follow, more close to the European Union or more close to Russia? And well, that's the first question. I mean, the rationality of the acts of this president. And well, and the second one is, I believe the Crimea situation is very difficult regarding what you said at the beginning. We are seeing here a direct intervention of a foreign country redefining borders, and of course many countries, many states that have different languages within the territory feel compelled by this situation. And as you mentioned, this is a very big issue and has a lot of implications over many other borders in Europe. So I would like to you to develop more of the implications of this particular subject on other regions in Europe.
I grew up in Sweden and I did all my academic work in Germany, so I have a very split vision of this on this question, and that's very interesting because if you look at the European debate, you can see that the European Union countries are also split in some along the lines of big importers of gas, small importers of gas, but also in the context of big countries, small countries, and border countries and countries far away from Russia. And so, but that's something I think it's important to have in mind when you think about the European reaction on this, because you have sometimes you get the impression that Germany, for instance, has a very long tradition of being good friends with Russia, in spite of Second World War. But there are many politicians who have this sort of reflex that, okay, the countries between Germany and Russia are a sea, are a place which you can divide between to balance out interests. Just the other day, a very revered, very old, now he's 95 years old, ex-Chancellor Helmut Schmidt expressed that he very well understood why the Russians are annexing the Crimea. He thought, well, let's not talk anymore about that. So that's what
Henry Kissinger did the same.
Yeah, but Henry Kissinger, he is on another level than Helmut Schmidt. I mean, I'm speaking about Europe. But the question I have is, that was just a comment. The question I have is, you mentioned the propaganda, and when you read European papers, and I read a lot of the reactions in Germany and in Sweden, and you see that there is a lot of arguments that come from the Kremlin. So how is your, you mentioned this figure that I haven't heard yet, that of 18 far-right parties in Europe, it seems like 14 are funded by the Kremlin. And on the other hand, and that was interesting because the Kremlin, because Russia asked some of the most infamous far-right parties in Western Europe to send observers to the ballots, to the votes on Crimea. You send nationalists from one part of the continent to look at nationalists from the other side. But on the other hand, Nadia, you didn't mention that which is the biggest issue at least in Germany and in Sweden among leftists, but also among non-socialists. How fascist is Svoboda? How infiltrated are you? How much? Because this also translates to a problem for European governments. How to deal with the government in Kiev. But that is a core issue of the Russian propaganda. So I would like to hear something about that.
This question is something that you always get asked during the revolution and after. that Ukrainians are fascists and Europe doesn't like that, they will not give us the money. That's the issue. The whole world is interested only in Ukraine as being a fascist state so that it's easy to make decisions. They're fascists, we don't like them. Let them die. In reality, we have nationalist party, which is called Svoboda, which was mainly supported by the Western Ukraine. It got into the parliament in 2012, I think. We had the new elections. All of a sudden they received 10% of votes. It was came as a surprise to the whole country because they were quite marching party that was playing on the nostalgia of Western Ukrainians for anti-Russian world. That they were using the names of the resistance movement of Ukrainian revolting army, which was also operating during the Second World War. Stepan Bandera, and we're all making jokes about that we're all Banderitsi. Bandera's joke is thinking of Antonio Banderas and other people with the similar name. So the Russians call us Banderitsi, so that they were fascists fighting against the Soviet army during the Second World War, who were fighting for Ukrainian independence, and who actually somehow cooperated with the Nazis during that time. So this is the argument of Russians saying that all movements in Ukraine are fascist. The party Svoboda is indeed the right party. It indeed has chauvinist rhetoric. Indeed, most of Ukraine is disgusted with it, and it has lost a lot of its support ever since it got into the parliament with 10% of votes. 2%.
Before the protest, 2%. The leadership, the leader of the party had 2% support before all this started. So this is how much they were popular before the protest started. I think after the protest probably they go up. I don't have the latest numbers with me here, but it was 2% before. It's Ukraine, if you look at the European Social Survey, Ukraine had one of the highest propensities in the values of people. What political scientists and sociologists will call demand for right-wing sort of ideology. And European Social Survey is actually one of the most credible sources. It's every 2 years it's done. And Ukraine had a high demand. I mean, I can send you, this is data over 3 or 4, so 8 to 10 years we are looking. And I would say naturally there was a political entrepreneur. Now I'm talking 3 years ago. There was a political entrepreneur to say, oh, wait a second, it's like 20% of Ukrainians, who have this value set. I'm going to provide this. Now let's look at numbers. I'm sorry I come too much as a numbers person, but I think it's important because that's the one way how you distinguish between propaganda and what's happening. So, how many ministers are there in the current government? Out of 18 ministers, there are 2. There are 2. Or 2.5 if you want to be most precise, but that's important. Then, before all this started with Yanukovych, how many Russians were attacked in Ukraine? 0. How many Russians were killed in Ukraine during the protests?
Quite a few.
1. One holder of a Russian passport by a sniper. By a sniper, which we officially we still don't know who was killed. Yeah. How many? No. I think this is important because we have to establish what's there. We have to establish what was before this, because now we are in an exciting situation, and you can take it as an outlier, or you can take it as something which happens in extraordinary circumstances. But look at the ordinary circumstances. And I think it's really important, apart from the language debate, and apart from the perennial divide between Western and Eastern Ukraine, pro-Russian and so, which is there, it's not, I don't deny it, there was no physical violence. And I think this is actually, I'm sorry, I'll pass you the word back, but I will answer the question to you about this. This is actually just indication. Europeans talk to themselves, but they get their brief. Some of them get their briefings from Moscow, And then basically in talking to themselves, actually there's no need for Russians to be present at the table. Already all the argumentations are there, and not only that they're there, they influence the decisions. It's skillfully done. I have to say, this doesn't say that Svoboda has not fascist element. They have elements. But Jobbik, the Hungarian party that was sent to monitor the Crimea referendum, is equally, if not, it used to be. Now they're peaceful family people, but they used to be, and they still have a label of being if not fascist, definitely chauvinist and extreme nationalist. So, you know, you turn that, and to answer that question, I would really turn to look at Europeans instead of squabbling with themselves, which is normal. It's 28 members of a family, it's a large family, but they should look at what the debate is in Moscow, and they should look at it from the inside, not with that. So I think this is one of the important things. And frankly speaking, if you look at that paper on Bruegel, I recommend. They operate with a number of $400 million that will cost Europe to stop completely using Russian gas over a period of 3 years. If that's true, that's a bargain. That's a bargain. I can't claim whether it's true. You have to ask some people who know better gas and energy policy than me. But in this respect, I think this is an excuse of Europe not to decide by themselves. And frankly speaking, for the big countries, it's also an excuse not to formulate their own policy or not to communicate it publicly to everybody else. Because Germany thinks that they can do their own policy, fine, but then let's do it, and let's do it publicly, because I think that's important, because that will also help their other peers. And then let's not talk about the European Union, and let's not talk about the European Commission. Let's talk about bilateral deals. And frankly speaking, in this, Russia has been Garry Kasparov and Anatoly Karpov in one, and Europe has just been learning chess in the bilateral deals.
I would come back to the right forces. During the Maidan, there was, starting from the violent protests on 19th of January, the new force arrived. It was called the Right Sector, Pravy Sector, which became a union of the patriotic and nationalist organizations that have been in Ukraine forever, but they have never been influential. They took responsibility for for the organized resistance to the police, and now they have actually turned into a political party, and you can see them on TV, of Russian TV and pro-Russian forces showing that there are Nazis or fascists in Ukraine. In reality, nobody really knows what this right sector is, who are all these people. And clearly, if they had been an organized force, we would have known about that, and they emerged in January all of a sudden. So they indeed operate, and we cannot deny that some of them have guns, and there has been an incident with the Sashko Biley, who entered one of the regional councils with a gun, speaking about democracy and anti-corruption. And he was killed by the police a few days ago, and this is the ongoing debate, and the people were protesting today in Kiev next to the parliament, demanding the resignation once again of the Minister of Interior, the new one, speaking that the police is killing people once again. So all these right sector movements are very controversial, and we clearly don't know where it will get us, because after the revolution there is always a fear that there will be armed people in the streets killing and looting, but I don't see the grounds for that fear to be significant.
Last fact: will a Nazi government have a Jew as vice prime minister? I don't think so. On top of that that Jew happens to be the president of the Ukrainian Jewish Association. So that's why I'm saying. I mean, it's not that now, don't get me wrong, facts could be also factoid. Just to list on your question. You see on the map there, I think it's important to look. So this is, Crimea, eastern Ukraine, basically from the blue on the right. That's also, historically, let's not forget that for some Russians, Ukraine has never become an independent country. That's just a mistake of a history. And Kiev is there their historical capital. So a lot of people, and you mentioned Schmidt, and this is the Cold War mentality, Kissinger and so on, but you know, they will say, yeah, it's their territory. We grabbed it for 25 years, give it to them, it belongs to them. But in this interdependent world, the key question, actually even Russians cannot operate like that any longer, because there's so much of mixing, and I think we are learning as we're doing it. Then Moldova, on the left, there is a region which de facto is controlled by Russians, Transnistria, from the Dniester River on the back. It's a small thing, but that could be a big problem. And Moldova has been promised a lot from the European Union, and it's on a track. Let's not forget Georgia. If you look on the right, there are two regions which are, again, de facto controlled by Russia. So that's more, but it will not stop, meaning it will not stop there. There is no Baltics. Baltics have all except Lithuania, meaning Estonia, and Latvia have a significant Russian minority, which actually has not been integrated. It's very much connected to Russia, and it has been funded traditionally by Russia. You know, as you have British Council, also you have Russian House, and they have been funding all these things over the last 20 years, and that's already getting closer to the core. Not to mention that if you use this principle, a lot of countries in the world probably will start using it. So I think it unsettles an order in which the Westerners thought that they have power and they control and they could do only. But now I think also everybody else in the world, and today's vote in the assembly, in the General Assembly of UN, also shows that you know, some countries will use it to say, we are fed up with you, Western world. Now we can also change the games, which is a legitimate wish. Now the question is whether that's a better world.
A couple more questions, Julian.
First, an observation. You are talking about the European Union, just like all we would have talked about the European Union 5 years before. But now you have to see that the European Union is a very complicated union with interests going in very different directions, and there is no question at all that Germany, for example, has more interest in good relations with Russia than in the democracy in Ukraine. And that's not only the gas or coming from Russia, but also the exportation of goods from Germany to Russia. They can export a lot of things to Russia, but not to Ukraine. So I think it's not a casualty that Putin speaks good German and Merkel speaks good Russian. Just look at that. But that's not my question. My question is going to Ukraine, and especially to the conflict in Ukraine. Is it an ethnic conflict between Ukrainians and Russian Ukrainians? And if it is an ethnic conflict, do the Ukrainians think that democracy is something like getting into the European Union and getting to capitalist consumerism, just like the people in Eastern Europe thought after Perestroika and after Glasnost, and they happily went to the European Union, and when they were there, they haven't capitalism, but capitalism is two social differences of a profound kind, is the loss of good health, a loss of the labor security. There's a lot of things. Maybe the Ukrainians are thinking that democracy means be part of a somewhat fantastic consumerism like in Western Europe sometime before.
Firstly, I would say that we don't have an ethnic conflict in Ukraine. This is a common image that can be as a result of the Russian propaganda that we can see on the Russian media. Probably there is more of it on international media. But the conflict during the revolution was in between Ukrainian people and the government, the police, the riot police and the police forces. This National Security Service, which was following the activists and kidnapping them and, well, we don't know, torturing for sure. We have a few instances of people being kidnapped by the law enforcement agencies. So this was the front line of the conflict. The ethnic makeup of Ukraine is indeed, we have Ukrainians, we have Russians, we have many other ethnic minorities, indigenous people from Crimea, but the conflict during the revolution was not in between the people. There were ethnic Russians who were fighting on Maidan for the democracy. There were people. The first people who were actually killed by the police was a Ukrainian of Armenian origin, Ukrainian of a Belarusian origin. There were ethnic Russians killed during the revolution. So this was not an issue. Although it would have been much easier if there were Ukrainians killing Russians, then it's straightforward. Let's turn to the concepts of genocide, ethnic cleansings, and then the issue is settled. But in reality, Ukraine is now coming through a process of creation of a real political inclusive nation. We have had these language issues that Western and Central Ukraine speaks Ukrainian language, and Eastern and South Ukraine speaking more of Russian language, which has been the part of our history. And our politicians during every elections to the parliament or the president have been manipulating this movement. That the East and South were told that if the nationalists come to the government, they will prohibit use of Russian language, they will oppress the Russian speakers, they will make everybody wear our traditional vyshyvankas, the embroidered shirts, make everybody worship Bandera, who was killing the Soviet soldiers. Also, all these things, in reality, not a single political party who came to the government ever imposed any threat to the Russian-speaking or Russian ethnic groups in Ukraine. So this was more of populism. And speaking about this capitalist choice of EU, we are a capitalist country. We have been one ever since independence. So there is no labor security in Ukraine. People from in the south who work as miners are now underpaid. The mines are getting closed. They are working on illegal mines without any trace of security. They go into these illegal mines. Many of them die every month. There are reports of these deaths on illegal mines. These illegal mines are covered by the oligarchs and the government, so the police does nothing about this. So there is no indication of any social security within the current state, and turning to Russia will not improve the situation. And turning the choice of EU for Ukraine is more of a civilization choice, not so much even of economic impact. Of course, there is economic impact indeed. These trade movements but it's more of who we are. Are we Europeans? Do we want democracy? Do we want human rights? Do we want dignity? Or we want slavery once again, like during the Soviet times when we didn't have civil rights, but we had some social security.
Let me start from that. And actually, interestingly enough, I consider myself social democrat, and I loathe the fact that in Europe there is a weak social democracy at the moment. Ukraine, actually, if you look at the Gini coefficient, I mean, it's a very unequal society at the moment. And that's because of this 20-25 years of developments that have happened. So actually the rogue capitalism that they have, it's deprived from ideology, so there's even not a story to be sold. So you have, and people see that this is it. It happens. It's all about the oligarchs. It's all about political class, and somehow it's for grabs. In many ways, actually, it looks very similar to what happens in Russia in terms of who has the money and who has the power. It's not very different even today, even if the government is new. I think what's important, let me say it not to put Nadia at spotlight. Crimea was never resolved. If you talk to Ukrainians, they will always tell you Crimea is unresolved issue, and nobody did enough to resolve Crimea to be part of Ukraine. They couldn't, they wouldn't, they were busy in stealing money, it doesn't matter. And actually, if you talk honestly to most of Ukrainians, maybe it's better that it's gone, because they don't have a problem. But if you look actually at what they, I mean, I know it's, I assume this is a Chatham House rule, you won't quote me on this and so on, but it's really, this is an unofficial sentiment. And I think it's fair, because there are official things, but there are also unofficial sentiments. As much as unfair it is, and actually as much as people feel that, still a part has been taken from off there. Now, on the economy, I think we have to separate, on Merkel and Putin and speaking the languages, I think it's very important to separate the economic argument from the geopolitical argument. So, if you think Germany's main partners, and I just checked them to be sure, I knew them, I was just like, to make sure that I don't make any mistake. Germany's partner number 10, export destination, is Poland. Germany's partner number 11 is Russia. Poland has 3.5 of exports that Germany sends. Russia has 3.2 of exports. If you look at the league tables, Russia is 11. So Poland, I say Poland because geostrategically Poland is the place up for grabs. And at the moment Poland actually gets more German goods than Russia, with all the pomp. It's one thing that we talk what's reality, what's potential. Probably there is bigger potential to sell more cars. Not probably, for sure there is a bigger potential in Russia. That I wouldn't. Then another thing what is important, when you look at the imports with Germany, you would again see that Russia is number 9, it's not insignificant, it's 4.1%. But, that pales in comparison with France, 11, China 8.3, even Belgium and Luxembourg has 6.7% of Germany's export, that Russia's pales in comparison. So I think it's important to look at this. This is not irreplaceable, don't get me wrong, this 3% sounds like, it's not the change that you can leave to the waiter. We're talking about percentages which are all industry, which is GDP and so on. But I think it's important to realize that this is not 10 or 15 or 20%, which will be of the nature of a cataclysmic disaster. So that's why I think it's important to look a lot to the security and geopolitical frame, because economy sometimes is convenient excuse, but it doesn't hold the entire argument to the end. It tells you that for the complexity of these argumentations, even for 3% or even less, some countries in Europe are not ready to sacrifice that. And I agree with you. We're talking now about big divisions. I mean, that's clear. That's not. I can say to regret, and I come outside of the European Union. And so personally, I could even say I don't have anything to do, but we have to do, because in the modern world, I do see Europe only as a unified bloc to do something outside. But That's wishful thinking, not the reality of the ground.
¿Alguna pregunta más? Sí.
I will talk in terms of Russia, but I would like to talk about some numbers. 36% of the gas consumed in Germany comes from Russia. Around 26% of the gas consumed in France and Italy it comes from Russia. But there are just numbers. I would like to talk about a new actor, which is China. Some days ago, there was an abstention in the Security Council of China about the intervention of Russia in Crimea. But I think that the strategy of China is not by the political side, but by the economic side, because there was a plan to buy millions of kilometers of land in Ukraine to cultivate some products. If we consider that China, or 11% of the economic structure of Ukraine, is in the agricultural sector, I think that will have an important significance on the economy of Ukraine. Well, moreover, Standard & Poor's gives Ukraine a CCC certification, so it is so dangerous to invest in Ukraine. So there are 2 points that I have to talk about Ukraine, about agriculture and confidence about how to invest in Ukraine. But I would like to talk about one subject, the geopolitical side. You have mentioned that Crimea is so important, and I do believe so. Not just by commercial consideration, but military consideration also. My question is, if we take into account that it's not a reminiscence of the East and West conflict of decades ago, but it's clear that it's a conflict that opposes 2 regions. On one side is the European Union, which is not unified, as Mr. said. But on the other side is Russia, but also China, which is advancing, but Central Asia and parts of Eastern Europe. So I would like to know what are your points of view about the implication of China in three aspects: the political, economy, and geostrategic consideration.
Thank you. Anybody else? Last comments?
Okay. You mentioned several things. Because the percentage is high and the replacement will bear some cost, those countries that you mentioned, they do not want to pay it. If there was, in the ideal world, if there was a solidarity to share that cost, meaning within the European Union, it would have been peanuts. And I say peanuts because let's not forget that the same European Union has bailed out some of its member states for much, much bigger amounts of money recently, be that Greece, or be that Ireland, or supporting Spain, and so on and so forth. So, but it's on a premise that people will be able to sit around a table like this and be solidar and agree with each other, and that's not happening right now. That's one thing. Second thing, what you mentioned, the conflict is not between Europe and Russia, or United States and Russia. Again, I will not remove Ukraine from this equation. Not because I'm sitting next to Ukrainians. Because if tomorrow, God forbid, Russian troops enter in Ukraine, there won't be American soldiers or European soldiers to be there. It will be Ukrainian soldiers. I hope it will not happen. But that's why the conflict is not about, it's about interest, and it's about interest sphere, it's about economy, it's about concept of life, ideology if you want, irrespectively how fake those ideologies on both sides are. But this is in a way, this is the thing, and that's why Europe is indecisive, because it is not their citizens. Let's not forget, Ukrainians are not part. They're neither part of European Union, so to be part of the common market, nor they're part of NATO, so that they've been protected by the NATO shield. And it's very, I would say, rational for politicians to say, wait a second, is it my citizens? No. And this is the first thing. Now, but the question is whether their citizens will be next. Not necessarily by direct military intervention, but by interference, because you establish interference in your direct neighborhood. And this is what those countries which are close to Ukraine are most afraid of. And the smaller you are, more afraid you are. And the Baltic countries are first. They immediately, they would allow America now to install every shield possible to serve as a deterrent. Because they know with whom they dealt. Let's not forget that Russia started with a cyber attack on Estonia. That was much before Georgia. If you see, there is a gradual boldness. And, I would argue, what's next? Because if you see the gradual boldness, it started with cyber attack, it ends up with annexation of a territory. What's the next step? But that's my opinion. Now, China, I have to say, I don't know enough. What I can tell you, there is some analysis, I don't know how good it is, on Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the think tank based in Washington. Actually, they have a center in Beijing, and they had an interesting piece where they look at the various world centers. They will look on Syria, and they look from Beirut, Beijing. There is an analysis from the Chinese perspective, and in a way, what has China to lose or gain. The bottom line of that analysis, and I don't know how correct it is, said that China has a lot to gain from abstaining in this process, because it's a bystander. It could profit in any way, either economically by gathering some of the business, if there is business relations which get spoiled between these partners, or in terms of geostrategic policy, to use some of these exceptions for their own means. But I'm not an expert on China and that part of the world to tell how much they will practically put it in faction. I think China will use it probably. That's something that those who analyze China relations and the Pacific, and I think for Peru in that respect, it would be relevant, is to look who from the aspiring hegemons might look at this and might use this as a global precedent, which doesn't involve West, of capturing a territory of another country.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much to the think tank initiative participants to have a long day of work. And thank you for all the Peruvian friends for participating in this meeting in English. And let's hope the best for Ukraine. Thank you very much.